Have you ever thought about um, the stories that kind of get pushed to the side in history, especially with something huge like the Vietnam War? We hear a lot about the soldiers on the front lines, obviously.
Yeah, we do. But what about the others who served? The ones whose stories maybe weren't told as often or acknowledged in the same way?
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today. We're looking at Kristin Hannah's novel, The Women. We've got a really insightful, spoiler-free review to guide us.
Right. And our goal here is to sort of unpack what this book reveals about, war, gender, resilience, especially focusing on the women who served in Vietnam, whose experiences have often been overlooked.
Yeah, this is really about shining a light, isn't it? Illuminating that piece of history that, as the review really stresses, just hasn't gotten enough attention, finding those invisible heroes.
Absolutely. These women served, they sacrificed, and then often they came home to a whole different kind of battle.
So let's start with the main character, Frances Frankie McGrath. The review sets her up as coming from this privileged Southern California life.
Yeah, quite privileged. And her initial motivation, it seems, is partly about defying those expectations, plus a real sense of duty. That's what leads her to sign up as an army nurse.
Okay, so she goes to Vietnam. And I imagine it's nothing like she pictured.
Oh, completely transformative. She's thrown right into the chaos, the trauma of a military hospital. It's intense.
But the review mentions she also forms these really deep bonds there,
Yeah.
amidst all that.
Yes, absolutely. With the other nurses, with soldiers. And through witnessing just unimaginable things, she discovers this inner strength. Hannah really makes you feel that transformation, according to the review.
How does she do that? Make it feel so real.
Well, the writing is described as just incredibly immersive. It doesn't shy away from the brutal reality of the field hospitals. You feel the pressure, the exhaustion.
Okay.
So Frankie's change isn't just about seeing trauma, it's about finding out what she's capable of. It's described as gut-wrenching, but also, empowering in a way.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But then, this is where it gets really interesting, as the review points out. The fight doesn't stop when she leaves Vietnam.
No, not at all. She comes home and she steps onto like a completely different battlefield.
Tell us about that. What were the challenges she faced back home?
Well, the book really highlights how society back then was just unwilling, really, to see or acknowledge the service of these women.
Right.
So Frankie's dealing with severe PTSD, which wasn't well understood then, especially for women. She's got survivor's guilt, and she's up against this constant systemic sexism.
Wow.
Yeah, so trying to rebuild her life in a country that basically wanted to forget the war ever happened. The review suggests that struggle was just as harrowing, maybe even more so, than her time in country because it was so isolating.
That idea of societal erasure,
hmm
it wasn't just being forgotten, it was like an active dismissal.
Exactly. That's a key theme the review pulls out, invisible service. It's not just being overlooked, it's being actively ignored or dismissed. And that denial, that lack of validation just deepens the trauma.
Makes recovery almost impossible, I'd imagine.
Pretty much. Frankie's story becomes representative, of thousands of real women who served bravely and then were told, implicitly or explicitly, that their service didn't count or wasn't the same.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other stories, what other contributions from different groups are still out there waiting for that recognition?
It's a huge question.
And you mentioned the brutality earlier. The book doesn't romanticize the war at all, right? How does Hannah convey that unflinching realism? Not just the physical wounds, but the psychological scars.
She's apparently very direct. The review mentions vivid, unsparing descriptions of the medical situations, the emotional cost. It's not gratuitous, but it's honest.
Okay.
The point Hannah seems to drive home is that the real battle often starts after the shooting stops. It's fought inside, silently. Frankie's post-war life is shown as just as gut-wrenching as her time in the hospital tents, the invisible wounds.
But amidst all that darkness, the review really emphasizes the bonds between the women and the nurses. That solidarity.
Oh, absolutely central. Those relationships Frankie forms with the other nurses, they're depicted as lifelines, sources of strength, of humor, incredibly dark humor sometimes, I bet,
I can imagine.
and just heartbreak, but shared heartbreak. The review highlights how that shared experience creates these unbreakable ties. It's that community that helps them endure.
So it's a war story, but it's also deeply about female friendship and support.
Very much so. And it's also a coming-of-age story for Frankie, wouldn't you say? Beyond just the war setting.
Definitely seems like it. She's finding her power, making tough choices, learning who she is in this world that keeps trying to label her. How does the war shape that personal growth?
Well, the war forces her to confront reality, shed that youthful idealism fast. The review suggests it's through this trial by fire that she discovers her own agency, her moral compass.
She learns to trust herself.
Exactly, to trust her instincts, maybe question authority when needed, and to find herself outside of what society expected of a woman like her back then. Extreme circumstances really can accelerate that self-discovery.
And Kristin Hannah's writing itself. The review praises it highly. Rich, immersive, character-driven. How does she make history feel so personal?
It sounds like it's her prose style. Accessible, but also quite poetic. She balances the intense battlefield descriptions with Frankie's inner emotional world.
That sounds like a difficult balance to strike.
It does, and the review notes she handles the graphic, traumatic stuff with real compassion. It's about impact, not shock value. Plus, the pacing seems deliberate, letting those emotional arcs unfold. And the dialogue, especially among the women, is called out as feeling very real.
That authenticity is key, I think.
It makes the emotional punch land harder and stick with you.
Now, Frankie's the heart, but the review mentions other compelling characters too, like the main male characters, Jamie and Rye.
Yeah, they apparently play complex roles, representing different perspectives on the war, on love, on how to survive it all. Their relationships with Frankie really raise the emotional stakes.
And the other nurses.
Oh yeah, they're described as unforgettable, not just background characters. Each has her own story, her own struggles. Together, they create this, multifaceted picture of women in wartime. Brave, smart, damaged, but resilient, and so often unacknowledged.
It sounds like their individual stories really weave together to show that larger resilience.
That's the impression. A tapestry, as you said.
Okay, so if someone's listening to this deep dive, who is this book really going to resonate with? Who should pick up The Women?
Well, definitely fans of historical fiction,
Yeah.
especially if you're interested in the Vietnam War era or maybe WWII stories.
Right? And if you appreciate strong female leads.
Absolutely. And stories with real emotional depth, exploring the human condition under pressure, if you like getting invested in characters.
What about people interested in those untold stories? Women's history, maybe?
For sure. If you're drawn to stories of courage and resilience from perspectives we don't always hear from, or even just powerful coming-of-age stories set against extreme backdrops.
And obviously, fans of Kristin Hannah's other books, like The Nightingale or The Great Alone, will probably feel right at home here.
Good point. Though it's worth mentioning again, the review flags it as emotionally intense. It deals with war, trauma, grief, pretty directly. So maybe be prepared for that. Mature readers recommended.
Good heads up. So overall, the review gives it a very high rating, right? Like 9.5 out of 10.
Yeah, extremely positive. The pros highlighted are clear, tackling a powerful, underrepresented subject, deeply emotional, empowering story, complex, memorable characters you really care about.
And the honest portrayal, the writing.
Exactly. Honest portrayal of trauma, love, loss, beautiful writing, impactful pacing, all major strengths, according to the review.
Were there any downsides mentioned? Any cons?
Just a few potential things. The heavy themes might just be too much for some readers, understandably. A few plot points might feel a touch overly dramatic for certain tastes. And maybe if you're looking for purely nonstop action, the focus on emotional journeys might feel a bit slower paced at times. But those seem like minor caveats compared to the praise.
Right. It sounds like overwhelmingly, The Women is seen as this stunning, really heartbreaking, but ultimately triumphant novel.
That's the takeaway. A powerful tribute to the women who served in Vietnam, and a really sharp reminder that some battles continue long after the soldiers come home.
Yeah. And that final thought, maybe connecting it to the bigger picture. It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. What other important stories, what other contributions, especially from groups who haven't always had the spotlight, are still out there, still waiting to be fully seen and acknowledged in our history?
And what role can stories like Frankie's, like this novel, play in bringing those narratives out of the shadows?
Exactly. How do these stories help us build a fuller, more honest picture of our past? It's something worth considering.